Marcus Thompson's weathered hands froze on the rifle barrel, his morning patrol interrupted by a sound that shouldn't exist in these ancient Olympic forests. The massive black bear trapped in the steel snare wasn't roaring in pain, it was whimpering like a lost child. This wasn't just any bear. The distinctive scar pattern across its left ear matched memories Marcus had buried 5 years deep. Maggie Clearwater's coffee mug shattered against her porch steps 300 yards away, the Cherokee elder's keen eyes catching the impossible scene through her binoculars. Her weathered voice cracked the morning silence. "Sweet Jesus, that's not possible." The bear's dark eyes locked onto Marcus with heartbreaking recognition, the same way his son Tommy used to look at him after a nightmare, before the accident. Before everything changed. "Call the Wildlife Center now," Marcus whispered into his radio, though his trembling finger couldn't find the button. His mind raced between past and present, between loss and impossible hope. How could this bear remember him, and why did it feel like Tommy was calling for help one more time? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The Olympic National Forest had been Marcus Thompson's sanctuary for the past 5 years, ever since the world stopped making sense. At 45, the Lakota Ranger carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd learned that some wounds never fully heal. They just become part of who you are. His weathered face, marked by lines that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won wisdom, had become as familiar to these ancient trees as the morning mist that clung to their branches. 3 miles down the winding forest road, Margaret Maggie Clearwater tended her small garden with the patience of someone who understood that good things took time to grow. At 68, the Cherokee elder moved with deliberate grace, her silver braids catching the early autumn light. Her modest farmhouse sat on the edge of the reservation, positioned perfectly between two worlds, the traditional ways of her ancestors and the modern reality that pressed against their sacred lands. Maggie had been Marcus's anchor through the darkest period of his life, when grief over losing his 8-year-old son Tommy threatened to pull him under completely. She understood loss in ways that went beyond words, having buried her husband of 43 years just 2 winters past. Her own children, scattered across the country pursuing careers in distant cities, called dutifully every Sunday, but lived lives that felt increasingly foreign to the woman who'd raised them on stories of the old ways. 5 years ago, Marcus had found a bear cub orphaned by poachers, its mother killed for her gallbladder. Against all regulations and common sense, he'd brought the tiny creature home, nursing it through those critical first weeks when survival hung by the thinnest thread. Maggie had helped, bringing traditional healing herbs and the kind of patient wisdom that couldn't be taught in any wildlife management course. For 6 months, the cub had lived in Marcus's world, sleeping in his garage, following him on safe trails, responding to his voice with the trust that only the very young can offer. They'd named him Charlie, though Marcus had always been careful not to let himself think of the bear as anything more than a temporary responsibility. When the time came to release Charlie back into the wild, Marcus had driven deep into the forest's heart, found a territory rich with salmon streams and berry patches, and watched his small friend disappear into the undergrowth without looking back. That had been 5 years ago, 5 years since Marcus had allowed himself to care for anything beyond his daily duties and the numbing routine of putting one foot in front of the other. 5 years since he'd felt the particular ache that came from loving something wild and letting it go. Now, staring at this massive bear caught in the cruel bite of an illegal snare, Marcus felt that old wound tearing open. The bear's eyes held intelligence and recognition that defied explanation, and somewhere in the rational part of his mind, Marcus knew this couldn't be his Charlie. Bears didn't live that long in the wild, didn't grow this large, didn't remember human kindness across such vast stretches of time. But his heart whispered otherwise. The steel snare had bitten deep into the bear's hind leg, the crude metal cable drawn so tight that dried blood matted the dark fur around the wound. Marcus approached slowly, his rifle ready but his heart hammering against his ribs. In 30 years of working with wildlife, he'd learned to read the signs of a dangerous animal: the flattened ears, the defensive posturing, the wild desperation in their eyes. This bear showed none of those warnings. Instead, it watched him with an almost human patience, its massive head tilted slightly as if listening to something only it could hear. When Marcus spoke, soft, reassuring words in the same tone he'd once used to calm his son after nightmares, the bear's ears perked forward. A low rumble emanated from its throat, not the threatening growl of a cornered predator, but something closer to recognition. "Easy there, big guy," Marcus murmured, setting down his rifle and pulling wire cutters from his pack. "Let's get you out of this mess." The bear shifted its weight but remained still as Marcus examined the snare. This wasn't the work of amateur poachers. The cable was aircraft-grade steel, anchored to a buried deadfall that would have taken considerable effort to install. Someone had planned this trap with military precision, choosing a game trail that funneled animals toward the hidden noose. Worse, Marcus spotted disturbed earth in a pattern that suggested more traps scattered throughout this section of forest. As he worked the cutters against the cable, the bear did something that stopped Marcus cold. It lifted its massive paw and gently placed it on Marcus's shoulder, not aggressive, not threatening, but with the careful deliberation of an old friend offering comfort. The gesture was so human, so impossibly tender, that Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. "Charlie?" The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. The bear's response sent ice through Marcus's veins. It huffed twice, paused, then huffed 3 times, the exact pattern Marcus had taught his rescued cub to signal when it was hungry. A pattern no wild bear should know, a behavior that should have been forgotten years ago. The cable snapped with a metallic ping and the bear immediately pulled its injured leg free. Marcus expected it to bolt into the forest, following every instinct to flee from human contact. Instead, the massive animal settled back on its haunches and continued watching him with those impossibly familiar dark eyes. That's when Maggie arrived, her old pickup truck coughing to a stop on the nearby service road. She'd monitored the Ranger radio frequencies for years, a habit developed during the lonely months after her husband's death when any human voice was better than silence. She emerged from the truck carrying a first aid kit and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen enough of life's surprises to take most things in stride. "Well, I'll be damned," she said quietly, taking in the scene. "That's not possible." "You see it too?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie approached slowly, her movements guided by decades of experience with wild animals. The bear turned its attention to her, and she stopped breathing. Across the creature's left ear, clearly visible now in the afternoon light, was a distinctive scar pattern, 3 parallel lines that formed a crude arrow shape. She'd helped Marcus treat those wounds 5 years ago when Charlie had tangled with a barbed wire fence during his rehabilitation. "Charlie, you old fool," she whispered, and the bear's ears perked forward at the sound of his name. "Where have you been, baby?" The bear rose and took a step toward her, then stopped. It looked back at Marcus, then at Maggie, then began a behavior that defied everything they knew about wild bear intelligence. Using its massive claws, it began scratching marks in the dirt, crude but deliberate symbols that formed a rough map. A circle representing the lake where Marcus had released him, lines indicating the mountain ridges that surrounded this valley, and a series of X marks scattered throughout the territory between. Marcus knelt beside the improvised map, his mind racing. "The other traps," he breathed. You're showing us where the other traps are." As if responding to his understanding, Charlie moved to a fallen log and rolled it aside with casual strength. Underneath, Marcus found the remains of a smaller snare, one that had already claimed a victim. The scattered bones belonged to a young deer, but caught in the ribs was something that made his blood run cold. A metal tag marked with numbers and letters that looked suspiciously like a research identification code. Maggie picked up the tag, her weathered fingers tracing the embossed lettering. "This isn't random poaching, Marcus. Someone's been using our forest as a testing ground." The implications hit them both simultaneously. Charlie hadn't just survived 5 years in the wild. He'd been protecting it, learning the patterns of whoever had been setting these traps, mapping their locations with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. And now he'd led them to the evidence. The veterinary clinic in Port Angeles buzzed with unusual activity as Dr. Sarah Windrider examined Charlie under the harsh fluorescent lights. Marcus paced the waiting room like an expectant father, while Maggie sat quietly in the corner, her fingers working prayer beads that had belonged to her grandmother. The metal tag they'd discovered had been sent to the tribal police, but Marcus's instincts told him this investigation was about to take a darker turn. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Windrider announced as she emerged from the examination room, her face pale beneath her auburn hair. "This bear has surgical scars, old ones professionally done. Someone's been operating on him." Marcus felt the floor shift beneath his feet. "What kind of operations?" "There's evidence of a tracking device implantation, removed, but the scar tissue is clear, and these markings along his spine." She paused, consulting her notes. "They're consistent with neural monitoring procedures. Someone's been studying this animal's brain activity." The implications crashed over Marcus like a rogue wave. Charlie hadn't just survived in the wild. He'd been captured, experimented on, and somehow escaped back to the forest that Marcus had always considered his sanctuary. The gentle giant who'd remembered their bond across 5 years had endured horrors that Marcus could barely comprehend. "There's more," Dr. Windrider continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The registration number on that tag, it belongs to a research facility that was shut down 3 years ago for ethical violations. But according to my contact at Fish and Wildlife, someone's been renewing the licenses under false names." Maggie's prayer beads clicked faster in the silence that followed. "Who would do such a thing?" "Dr. Richard Blackwood," came a voice from the clinic's entrance. Chief Robert Stormcrow of the tribal police stepped into the waiting room, his expression grim. "We ran the numbers. The facility was originally registered to a veterinarian who lost his license after a malpractice case involving experimental treatments on companion animals." Marcus felt ice forming in his chest. "What kind of treatments?" "Behavioral modification therapy. He was using animals to treat human trauma patients, PTSD, grief counseling, that sort of thing. The state shut him down when they discovered he was capturing wild animals instead of using domestic ones." Chief Stormcrow consulted his notes. "The case that ended his career involved a child who died during one of his sessions. Parents sued for wrongful death." The name triggered a memory so painful that Marcus had to grip the back of a chair for support. Tommy's final day had involved a visit to a special therapist, someone who claimed he could help children process trauma through animal interaction. Marcus had been desperate enough to try anything after months of watching his son retreat further into silence following his parents' bitter divorce. "What was the child's name?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Chief Stormcrow's expression softened. "Thomas Thompson, 8 years old. Died from an allergic reaction during an experimental session with an untrained bear cub." The world tilted sideways. Maggie was on her feet instantly, her strong arms catching Marcus as his knees buckled. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Tommy hadn't died in a hiking accident as he'd told everyone. His son had died because Marcus had trusted a disgraced veterinarian who promised impossible healing through dangerous methods. "No," Marcus whispered, but the memories were flooding back now, sharp and merciless. The consent forms he'd signed without reading carefully, the assurances that the treatment was safe, that dozens of children had benefited from Dr. Blackwood's revolutionary approach. The phone call that shattered his world on a Tuesday afternoon 5 years ago. "Marcus," Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "You've carried this burden long enough. It wasn't your fault." But Marcus was already moving, pushing past Chief Stormcrow toward the examination room where Charlie waited. The bear looked up as he entered, those intelligent dark eyes reading the anguish written across Marcus's face. Without hesitation, Charlie rose and pressed his massive head against Marcus's chest, offering the same comfort he'd provided as a cub. "You remember him, don't you?" Marcus whispered against Charlie's fur. "You remember Tommy." Dr. Windrider appeared in the doorway, her professional composure cracking. "Marcus, there's something else. There's something." "When I sedated him for the examination, he kept repeating a specific behavior, reaching toward something that wasn't there, like he was trying to comfort an invisible child." The words broke something fundamental inside Marcus's chest. Charlie hadn't just survived Blackwood's experiments. He'd been conditioned to provide comfort, trained to ease suffering in ways that a wild animal should never have learned. And somewhere in his magnificent mind, he'd retained memories of the little boy who died in his presence. Chief Stormcrow stepped into the room, his radio crackling with urgent chatter. "We've got a location on Blackwood, abandoned research facility about 20 miles east of here, near the old logging roads. My officers are requesting backup. They're hearing animal sounds from inside the building." Marcus looked up from Charlie's embrace, and Maggie saw something shift in his expression. The grief was still there, raw and bleeding, but underneath it burned something harder and more dangerous. "How many other children?" Marcus asked quietly. "We don't know yet." "But, Marcus," Chief Stormcrow raised a hand in warning. "This is a police matter now. Let us handle it." But Marcus was already reaching for his ranger jacket, his mind calculating distances and response times. Somewhere out there, Blackwood was still operating, still using captured animals to experiment on vulnerable people, still destroying lives in the name of healing. Charlie moved to block the doorway, a low rumble in his throat that wasn't threatening but unmistakably insistent. When Marcus tried to step around him, the bear gently but firmly pushed him back. "He wants to come with you," Dr. Windrider observed quietly. Marcus met Charlie's gaze, seeing determination that matched his own. They'd both lost something precious to Blackwood's twisted vision of therapy. They'd both survived when they should have been destroyed, and they both understood that some debts could only be paid in person. The abandoned research facility crouched in the forest like a malignant growth, its weathered concrete walls stained with moss and decay. Marcus approached on foot through the dense undergrowth, Chief Stormcrow's warnings echoing in his mind. Charlie moved beside him with surprising stealth for such a massive creature, his dark fur blending with the shadows between the towering Douglas firs. 20 yards from the building's perimeter, Marcus heard them, the unmistakable sounds of distressed animals, low moans, scratching claws against metal, the desperate whimpers of creatures trapped beyond hope. His ranger training kicked in, cataloging the different voices, black bears, certainly, but also what sounded like wolves and possibly mountain lions. Blackwood hadn't limited his collection to a single species. Through grimy windows, Marcus caught glimpses of movement inside. Cages lined the walls of what had once been a legitimate veterinary clinic, each one containing a wild animal in various states of psychological breakdown. Some paced endlessly in tight circles. Others sat motionless with the vacant stare of creatures whose spirits had been systematically broken. Charlie pressed against Marcus's leg, a low whine escaping his throat as he recognized the familiar hell of his own captivity. Marcus placed a steadying hand on the bear's massive head, feeling the tremor that ran through the powerful body. They were both remembering now, Charlie his months of torment, Marcus the phone call that had destroyed his world. The facility's main door stood ajar, revealing a corridor lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Marcus drew his service weapon and stepped inside, Charlie padding silently behind him. The stench hit them immediately. Animal waste, antiseptic, and underneath it all, the sour smell of fear that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. "Hello, Marcus." The voice came from the shadows at the far end of the corridor, cultured and calm despite the circumstances. Dr. Richard Blackwood stepped into the light, a man in his 50s whose once handsome features were now marked by obsession and sleepless nights. His lab coat was stained, his hair unkempt, but his eyes burned with the fervor of someone who believed absolutely in his own righteousness. "I wondered when you'd find me," Blackwood continued, making no move to flee. "Though I must admit I didn't expect you to bring my old test subject along." Marcus kept his weapon trained on the veterinarian, but his voice was steady. "Let them go, Richard. All of them." Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Let them go. Marcus, you don't understand what we're doing here. These animals aren't prisoners, they're healers. They're learning to save people like your son." The mention of Tommy sent rage coursing through Marcus's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Tommy is dead because of you. Tommy died because I wasn't allowed to perfect the process." Blackwood's composure cracked, revealing the madness underneath. "The state shut me down just as I was making real breakthroughs. Do you know how many children I could have saved if they'd let me continue? How many families could have been spared the agony you've endured?" Behind them, Charlie rose on his hind legs, his massive frame filling the corridor. At 8 feet tall, he was a wall of barely contained fury, but he held his position, waiting for Marcus's signal. The bear understood something that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. Blackwood wasn't just a criminal. He was a broken man whose grief had metastasized into something monstrous. "Show me," Marcus said quietly. Blackwood's eyes lit up with evangelical fervor. "Yes. Yes, you'll see. Come." He led them deeper into the facility, past cages that contained animals Marcus recognized from missing wildlife reports dating back 3 years, a family of wolves that had vanished from the Cascade Mountains. 2 mountain lion cubs taken from their mother in the Olympic Peninsula, bears of various ages, all showing the same vacant stare that spoke of systematic psychological manipulation. The corridor opened into a large room that had once been a surgical suite. Now it housed Blackwood's masterpiece, a complex arrangement of cages surrounding a central area furnished like a child's playroom. Toys lay scattered across colorful mats, their bright plastic cheerfulness obscene in this context. "This is where the real work happens," Blackwood explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a favored student. "I bring the children here, the ones the conventional therapists have given up on. Children with severe PTSD, autism, attachment disorders, and I introduce them to my specially trained animals." Marcus felt sick as he took in the scene. In the corner, a small camera on a tripod pointed toward the play area, its red recording light blinking steadily. "You're filming them?" "For research purposes, of course. How else can I document the breakthrough moments? The instant when a broken child connects with an animal that's been conditioned to provide specific therapeutic responses." Charlie moved past Marcus, approaching one of the cages that contained a female black bear roughly his own age. She didn't react to his presence, didn't even lift her head from her paws. The light had gone out of her eyes completely, leaving behind the hollow shell of what had once been a magnificent wild creature. "That's Bella," Blackwood said proudly. She's my star performer, trained to provide deep pressure therapy for children with anxiety disorders. She can detect panic attacks before they begin and respond with precisely calibrated physical contact. Marcus watched Charlie nuzzle the bars of Bella's cage, trying desperately to reach his traumatized counterpart. The big bear's distress was palpable, his huffing breath forming small clouds in the cold air. This was what Charlie had escaped from, not just physical captivity, but the systematic destruction of everything that made him wild and free. "How many children have you brought here?" Marcus asked. 17 over the past 3 years, all of them showing remarkable improvement by the time their parents took them home. The casual mention of parents made Marcus's blood run cold. "Their parents know about this place?" Blackwood's smile was genuinely warm, which somehow made it more disturbing. "Oh yes, I'm very selective about my clients. Only families who've exhausted all conventional options, who are desperate enough to try anything. Parents like you were, Marcus. Parents who would sign any waiver, pay any amount, if there was even a chance their child might be healed." The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tommy hadn't been Blackwood's only victim. He'd been the first in a new generation of children subjected to increasingly dangerous experimental treatments. And their parents, broken by desperation and false hope, had been willing accomplices in their own children's exploitation. "Where are the others?" Marcus demanded. "Safe at home with their families, of course. Well, most of them." Blackwood's expression darkened slightly. "There have been a few setbacks. Children who couldn't handle the intensity of the animal bonding process. But that's the nature of pioneering work. There are always casualties." Charlie had moved to another cage, this one containing a wolf pup that couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The young animal cowered at the back of its enclosure, its fear so complete that it had stopped eating. Marcus could see its ribs through its matted fur. "You're killing them," Marcus said simply. "I'm saving them." Blackwood's voice rose to a shout, echoing off the concrete walls. "Do you know what it's like to watch a child die because conventional medicine fails them? To hold a parent while they sob over their baby's grave, knowing that you could have made a difference if society hadn't been so narrow-minded about innovation?" For the first time, Marcus heard genuine pain in Blackwood's voice. Beneath the madness and obsession was a grief that matched his own. The agony of a parent who'd lost everything and couldn't accept that some tragedies simply couldn't be prevented. "Your daughter," Marcus said quietly. "She died, didn't she?" Blackwood's facade crumbled completely. Tears streamed down his face as he nodded. "Leukemia, 8 years old, just like your Tommy. The treatments weren't working and she was so scared, so lonely in that hospital room. I brought her a therapy dog, just a regular golden retriever from the hospital program. But in those final weeks, watching her interact with that dog, I saw something extraordinary happening." He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, leaving streaks of dirt across his cheeks. She wasn't afraid anymore. The dog seemed to know exactly when she needed comfort, when she needed to laugh, when she needed to feel brave. It was like they were communicating on a level that transcended species. And I thought, what if I could enhance that connection? What if I could train animals to provide targeted therapeutic interventions that no human therapist could match? Marcus felt his anger wavering in the face of such raw pain. Blackwood wasn't just a monster. He was a father whose love had curdled into something destructive and desperate. But that understanding didn't change what he'd done, didn't excuse the suffering he'd caused. "She wouldn't want this," Marcus said gently. "Your daughter wouldn't want other children to suffer because you couldn't save her." Blackwood looked around the facility as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The cages full of broken animals, the camera recording everything, the toys scattered across the floor where terrified children had been forced to interact with creatures too traumatized to provide genuine comfort. His grand vision of healing had become a factory of fresh trauma. "I just wanted to help," he whispered. Charlie approached Blackwood slowly, his massive head tilted in an expression that Marcus recognized. It was the same look he'd given Tommy during those final therapy sessions. Not the vacant compliance of a trained animal, but the genuine compassion of a creature that understood suffering. Without warning, the bear gently placed his paw on Blackwood's shoulder, offering the same comfort he'd given Marcus in the veterinary clinic. The touch broke something fundamental in Blackwood's composure. He collapsed against Charlie's massive frame, sobbing with the abandon of a man who'd been carrying impossible weight for far too long. And Charlie, despite everything this man had done to him, despite the months of captivity and conditioning, stood patiently and let him grieve. In that moment, Marcus understood something profound about forgiveness. It wasn't about absolving the guilty, but about breaking the cycle of pain that trapped everyone involved. Blackwood's crimes were real and devastating, but his humanity was real too. And perhaps, just perhaps, acknowledging both truths was the first step toward something approaching healing. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the Olympic Peninsula as Marcus helped Blackwood unlock the cages, each metallic click echoing through the facility like a small victory against despair. Charlie had positioned himself near the entrance, his massive frame alert to every sound from the approaching storm. The weather forecast had called for severe thunderstorms moving in from the Pacific, but Marcus hadn't anticipated how quickly the system would arrive. "We need to move faster," Chief Stormcrow's voice crackled over the radio. "Flash flood warnings are in effect for your area. That facility sits in a natural drainage basin. If the creek overflows, you'll be cut off." Marcus looked around the main room, counting 17 cages containing animals in various states of trauma. The logistics of moving them all to safety seemed overwhelming, especially with an unstable veterinarian and a storm system bearing down on them. But as he watched Charlie gently coax the traumatized female bear from her enclosure, Marcus realized they weren't just rescuing animals, they were undoing years of systematic psychological damage that would take months to heal. "The wolves go first," Blackwood said, his professional instincts taking over despite his emotional breakdown. "They're pack animals. They'll follow each other once we get the alpha female moving." The wolf pack consisted of 4 adults and 2 pups, all showing signs of severe stress conditioning. The alpha female cowered at the back of her cage, her yellow eyes reflecting a fear so complete that she'd forgotten her own predatory nature. When Marcus opened the door, she didn't move until Charlie approached and made a series of low vocalizations, not typical bear sounds, but something closer to wolf communication. "Jesus Christ," Blackwood whispered. "He's learned their language." Indeed, Charlie seemed to be speaking to each species in their own vocal patterns, offering reassurance in ways that transcended his natural behavioral programming. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Charlie hadn't just survived his captivity, he'd become a translator between species, a bridge that allowed traumatized animals to remember what they'd lost. The first drops of rain began pattering against the facility's windows as they moved the wolves into a transport trailer that Chief Stormcrow's team had brought. The animals huddled together in the corner, still too frightened to trust their newfound freedom. Marcus checked his watch. They'd been working for 40 minutes, and the storm was intensifying with each passing moment. "The mountain lions next," Blackwood directed, but his voice carried a new urgency. Through the windows, Marcus could see the forest canopy swaying violently in the wind. The facility's aging electrical system flickered, casting intermittent shadows across the rescue operation. As they approached the mountain lion enclosures, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The concrete floor near the back of the facility showed water stains, high water marks from previous floods that reached nearly 3 feet up the walls. This place had flooded before, and if the animals had been caged during those incidents. "How many?" Marcus asked quietly. Blackwood followed his gaze to the water stains, his face going pale. "3 floods in the past 2 years. I managed to evacuate them the first 2 times." "And the 3rd time?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the increasing intensity of rain against the windows. When Blackwood finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. 6 animals, 2 bears, 3 wolves, and a mountain lion. I was in Seattle when the storm hit. By the time I got back," he gestured helplessly at the watermarks, "I told myself they didn't suffer long." Marcus felt rage building in his chest again, but Charlie's presence beside him provided an anchor of calm. The big bear seemed to understand that anger wouldn't save the animals still trapped here, wouldn't prevent another tragedy from unfolding in real time. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the building, followed immediately by a sound that made everyone freeze, the distant roar of fast-moving water. Through the facility's rear windows, Marcus could see the normally placid creek that ran behind the building transforming into a churning torrent of brown water and debris. "We're out of time," Chief Stormcrow announced over the radio. "Water's already over the access road. You need to get out now." Marcus did a quick count. They'd managed to evacuate 11 animals, leaving 6 still caged. 2 bears, including the traumatized female that Charlie had tried to comfort, 3 wolf pups, and an elderly mountain lion that hadn't moved from the back of its enclosure since they'd arrived. "I'm not leaving them," Marcus declared. "The building's going to flood," Blackwood said, his clinical objectivity warring with his guilt. "Even if we get them out of the cages, we can't transport them in these conditions." But Charlie was already moving, padding toward the rear of the facility where the most traumatized animals remained. He approached the elderly mountain lion's cage and began making soft chirping sounds, the kind of vocalizations that mother cats use to calm their young. The old cat lifted his head for the first time, golden eyes focusing on Charlie with something that might have been hope. "He's showing us the way," Maggie's voice came from the facility entrance. Marcus turned to see the Cherokee elder standing in the doorway, rain dripping from her silver hair. The traditional stories speak of times when the 4-legged teachers guide the 2-legged ones through crisis. "Maggie, what are you doing here?" Marcus called. "Bringing supplies," she replied, hefting a large duffel bag, "and remembering old wisdom about floods." She unzipped the bag to reveal lengths of rope, emergency flares, and most importantly, several large tarps. "The building won't flood evenly. Water flows to the lowest points first. If we can create temporary barriers, guide the water around the animal enclosures." Blackwood's eyes lit up with understanding. "The floor slopes toward the main drainage. If we can channel the water away from the cage area, we might buy enough time for the storm to pass." Another crack of thunder, this one close enough to rattle the windows. Through the facility's rear entrance, Marcus could see water beginning to seep under the door. They had minutes, maybe less, before the building became a death trap. Charlie made the decision for all of them. The massive bear approached the traumatized female in the nearest cage and, using his claws with surprising delicacy, began working at the latch mechanism. His movements were precise, purposeful, not the random behavior of a panicked animal, but the deliberate actions of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. "He's opening the cages," Blackwood breathed. One by one, Charlie freed the remaining animals, but instead of fleeing toward the exits, they gathered around him in a tight cluster. The bears pressed against his flanks, the wolf pups tucked themselves beneath his massive frame, and even the elderly mountain lion approached to touch noses with their unlikely savior. Marcus realized what Charlie was doing, creating a safe formation that would allow the traumatized animals to move as a group, taking strength from his presence. But the water was rising faster now, already ankle-deep and climbing steadily. "The high ground!" Maggie called, pointing toward a raised platform at the facility's center where Blackwood had kept his recording equipment. "We can get them up there. Wait for the water to recede." Working together, they guided the animals toward the platform. Charlie led the way, his calm presence providing an anchor for creatures too damaged to trust their own instincts. Marcus and Blackwood lifted the smaller animals while Maggie used her knowledge of wildlife behavior to encourage the larger ones to climb. But as they worked, Marcus noticed something that filled him with dread. The water wasn't just rising, it was rising faster than the storm could account for. Through the facility's windows, he could see debris floating past at tremendous speed, including entire trees torn from their roots. "Dam break!" Chief Stormcrow's voice crackled urgently over the radio. "Beaver Dam upstream gave way. You've got maybe 10 minutes before the main surge hits." 10 minutes to save 6 traumatized animals and get everyone to safety. 10 minutes to undo years of Blackwood's crimes and prevent a tragedy that would dwarf everything that had come before. Marcus looked at Charlie, who was systematically checking each animal to ensure they were secure on the platform. The bear's intelligence and compassion in this moment transcended everything Marcus thought he knew about the boundaries between species. Here was a creature that had every reason to hate humans, every justification for leaving his tormentors to face the consequences of their choices. Instead, Charlie was teaching them all something profound about the nature of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. The water reached their waists as Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The main surge hit with the force of a freight train, transforming the research facility into a churning maelstrom of debris and rising water. Marcus felt the platform shudder beneath them as the flood smashed through the rear wall, carrying with it 40 years of accumulated forest debris, fallen trees, boulders, and the twisted remains of abandoned logging equipment that had been waiting decades for this moment of catastrophic release. Charlie stood at the center of their makeshift ark, his massive frame providing stability as the traumatized animals pressed against him in terror. The elderly mountain lion, who hadn't moved voluntarily in months, now clung to Charlie's back with desperate claws. The wolf pups had burrowed so deeply into his thick fur that only their amber eyes were visible, reflecting the facility's failing emergency lights. "The platform's breaking loose," Blackwood shouted over the roar of water and wind. Indeed, Marcus could feel their refuge beginning to shift as the flood undermined its concrete moorings. What had seemed like salvation moments ago was now becoming another death trap. Maggie moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who'd lived through 70 years of Pacific Northwest storms, checking the rope anchor she'd hastily rigged to keep the animals from being swept away. But even her practiced hands trembled as she worked, and Marcus could see the fear in her eyes, fear not for herself, but for the creatures they'd sworn to protect. "We need to get higher," Marcus called, scanning the facility's interior. The flood had risen to nearly 6 feet now, and their platform floated like a boat in an increasingly violent sea. But there was nowhere higher to go. The facility's ceiling was less than 10 feet above them, and water continued pouring in through breached walls and failing seals. That's when Charlie did something that defied every law of animal behavior Marcus had ever learned. The massive bear began pushing the smaller animals toward Maggie, using his body to shield them from debris, while simultaneously guiding them into her protective embrace. His actions were so purposeful, so clearly communicative, that even Blackwood stopped his panicked calculations to stare. "He's organizing them," the veterinarian whispered. "He's creating a survival hierarchy." Charlie had positioned the most vulnerable animals, the wolf pups and the catatonic female bear, closest to Maggie, where her ropes and tarps provided maximum protection. The stronger animals formed a defensive circle around this core, with Charlie himself serving as both anchor and shield against the increasingly violent waters. But the intelligence of his actions only made what happened next more heartbreaking. A massive Douglas fir, its root system undermined by the flood, crashed through the facility's front wall like a battering ram. The impact sent a shock wave through the water that knocked everyone off balance, and in the chaos that followed, Marcus watched in horror as the traumatized female bear, the one Charlie had tried so desperately to comfort, was swept away from their group. Charlie's roar of anguish echoed off the concrete walls, a sound that conveyed more raw emotion than most humans could express in a lifetime of words. Without hesitation, he plunged into the churning water after her, his powerful strokes fighting against a current that had already claimed trees older than the state of Washington. "Charlie, no!" Marcus dove after them, but the flood's power was absolute. He found himself swept toward the facility's rear wall, his ranger training the only thing keeping him from panicking as debris closed over his head. When he surfaced, gasping and choking on the muddy water, Charlie and the female bear had vanished into the maelstrom. Maggie's voice cut through his despair like a lifeline. "Marcus! The ceiling!" He looked up to see that the rising water had brought them within reach of the facility's ventilation system, a network of metal ducts that might, just might, provide access to higher ground. But the remaining animals were in full panic now. Their careful formation dissolved into individual struggles for survival. Blackwood, his face streaked with mud and tears, was holding one of the wolf pups above his head, trying to keep its muzzle clear of the water. "I can't hold on much longer," he gasped. The elderly mountain lion had managed to claw his way onto a floating piece of debris, but his strength was failing visibly. The remaining animals were scattered across the facility's interior, each fighting their own battle against the inexorable rise of water that showed no signs of slowing. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. With Charlie gone, someone had to coordinate their survival efforts, and that responsibility fell to him. He swam to the nearest ventilation grate and began working frantically at the corroded screws that held it in place, his Ranger multi-tool the only thing standing between them and complete disaster. The first screw came loose just as another surge of water lifted them all toward the ceiling. Marcus could feel the facility's structure beginning to fail around them. Walls buckling, support beams groaning under stresses they were never designed to bear. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the entire building collapsed into the raging torrent outside. "Maggie first," he called, but the Cherokee elder shook her head stubbornly. "Animals first. Always animals first." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades mediating between the human and natural worlds. That's what Charlie would want. Working together, they began lifting the traumatized creatures into the ventilation system. The wolf pups went first, their small bodies easily fitting through the opening Marcus had created. The elderly mountain lion required more coaxing, but Maggie's gentle voice and skilled hands convinced him to trust them one final time. As they worked, Marcus found himself thinking about Charlie's sacrifice. The bear could have saved himself, could have abandoned the group and used his superior swimming ability to reach safety. Instead, he'd chosen to risk everything for a creature so damaged by human cruelty that she'd forgotten how to hope. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Charlie, the innocent victim of Blackwood's experiments, had demonstrated more humanity than any of the humans involved. His willingness to forgive, to protect, to sacrifice for others stood in stark contrast to the cycles of pain and retribution that had brought them all to this moment. "He's not coming back," Blackwood said quietly, his clinical assessment cutting through Marcus's desperate hope. The veterinarian's face had aged years in the past hour, his earlier evangelical fervor replaced by something approaching genuine humility. The current's too strong, even if he reached her. Another section of wall gave way, sending a new torrent of water and debris cascading into their shrinking refuge. The remaining animals, now reduced to just 2 wolves and a young bear, huddled against Maggie as she prepared to lift them into the ventilation system. But before she could complete the rescue, the facility's main support beam cracked with a sound like gunfire. The ceiling began to sag ominously, and Marcus realized with crystal clarity that they were out of time. The building was about to collapse, taking them all down into the roiling flood waters below. "Go!" he shouted to Maggie, pushing her toward the ventilation opening. "Get them out!" But even as he spoke, Marcus knew it was too late. The water had risen to within inches of the ceiling, and the structural failure was accelerating beyond their ability to respond. The facility that had housed so much suffering was about to become a tomb for its final occupants. In those last desperate moments, as the walls closed in and the water rose inexorably toward the ceiling, Marcus thought he heard something impossible. Charlie's voice, calling to them from somewhere beyond the chaos. But that was surely just wishful thinking, the mind's desperate attempt to find hope in the face of absolute catastrophe. The ceiling gave way with a grinding roar of concrete and twisted metal, and the Olympic National Forest Research Facility collapsed into the flood that had been building toward this moment for decades. In the space of heartbeats, years of scientific work, criminal activity, and attempted redemption were swept away by forces far more powerful than human ambition or animal intelligence. But somewhere in the darkness of the churning water, love and sacrifice had planted seeds that even disaster couldn't destroy. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to change everything. Consciousness returned to Marcus in fragments, the taste of mud and river water, the distant sound of rescue helicopters, and a warmth pressed against his side that felt impossibly familiar. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on a rocky outcrop 50 yards downstream from where the research facility had stood, surrounded by debris from the flood that had swept away everything in its path. Charlie lay beside him, his massive frame battered but breathing, one powerful paw resting protectively across Marcus's chest. The bear's dark fur was matted with mud and blood from dozens of cuts, but his eyes held the same intelligent awareness that had first caught Marcus's attention in the trap. More incredibly, nestled against Charlie's other side was the traumatized female bear, alive but unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. "Jesus Christ, they're both alive," came a voice from above. Marcus looked up to see Chief Stormcrow rappelling down the cliff face, followed by 2 paramedics and Dr. Windrider. The rescue team had been searching for survivors since the storm passed, but finding them here, in this configuration, defied every expectation. "How long?" Marcus croaked, his throat raw from swallowing flood water. 6 hours, Dr. Windrider replied, beginning her examination of the bears, while the paramedics checked Marcus's vital signs. "The flood peaked about 3 hours ago. We've been looking for you since we could get aircraft in the air." As the medical team worked, Marcus pieced together fragments of memory from the disaster, the facility collapsing, the rush of water carrying them into the raging creek, Charlie's powerful swimming keeping them afloat as they were swept downstream. But there were gaps, crucial moments where his memory simply went dark, leaving him to wonder how they'd survived when so many others hadn't. "The other animals?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the expressions on the rescue team's faces. Chief Stormcrow's response was gentle but direct. "We found Maggie and Dr. Blackwood about a mile downstream. They're both alive, both in stable condition at Port Angeles General. Maggie managed to save 2 of the wolf pups in the ventilation system. They're traumatized but physically unharmed." Marcus closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of loss. Out of 17 animals they'd attempted to rescue, only 4 had survived. The mathematics of tragedy were stark and unforgiving, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had happened in those dark waters, something that transcended simple arithmetic. "There's something else," Dr. Windrider said quietly, her examination of the female bear revealing details that challenged everything they thought they knew about the night's events. "This bear has fresh surgical scars, less than 12 hours old. And someone performed emergency medical treatment on her injuries during the flood." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "That's impossible. We were all fighting for our lives." But even as he spoke, Marcus remembered Charlie's behavior during the rescue. The deliberate way he'd positioned the animals, the almost surgical precision with which he'd guided their escape attempts. Had the bear somehow learned enough from his captivity to provide medical intervention? The idea seemed fantastical, yet the evidence was undeniable. Dr. Windrider continued her examination, documenting findings that would challenge veterinary science for years to come. "The suturing technique is crude but effective. Someone with basic medical knowledge treated a severe laceration on her abdomen, probably saving her life. But the positioning of the stitches, the materials used—" She looked up at Marcus with wonder in her eyes. "This was done with bear claws and plant fibers." "No human could have performed this surgery," Charlie rumbled softly, a sound that conveyed satisfaction rather than distress. When Dr. Windrider approached to examine his own injuries, he remained perfectly still, allowing her to document the extent of his wounds. The bear's cooperation was complete and intelligent, as if he understood that these humans were different from the ones who had tormented him. The helicopter evacuation to Port Angeles General took 20 minutes, but for Marcus it felt like a journey between worlds. Below them, the Olympic Peninsula stretched out in its post-storm clarity. Ancient forests scarred by the flood but fundamentally unchanged. Mountains that had witnessed countless cycles of destruction and renewal. From this altitude, the research facility's destruction seemed less like a tragedy and more like a necessary cleansing. At the hospital, Marcus found Maggie sitting beside Blackwood's bed in the intensive care unit. The Cherokee elder looked every one of her 68 years, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief, but her eyes held a peace that hadn't been there before the flood. Blackwood was unconscious, connected to machines that monitored his vital signs with electronic precision. "He saved them," Maggie said without preamble as Marcus approached. When the ventilation system started to collapse, he used his own body to shield the wolf pups, took a support beam to the head rather than let them get crushed. Marcus studied the unconscious veterinarian, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Beneath the obsession and moral blindness was a man who had genuinely loved his daughter, who had twisted that love into something monstrous, but who retained, at his core, the capacity for selfless action. The flood had stripped away everything non-essential, revealing the complicated truth of human nature in its rawest form. "The families," Marcus said suddenly, remembering Blackwood's claims about successful treatments. "The children he said he'd helped, we need to follow up on them." Maggie nodded grimly. "Chief Stormcrow's already on it. Preliminary investigations suggest most of the success stories were fabricated. But there are 3 families." She paused, choosing her words carefully. 3 families who insist their children showed genuine improvement after sessions with Blackwood's animals. The revelation opened up uncomfortable questions about the nature of healing and the ethics of unconventional treatment. Had some children actually benefited from interaction with the traumatized animals? Was it possible that genuine therapy could emerge from fundamentally unethical circumstances? Marcus found himself grappling with paradoxes that had no clean answers. Dr. Windrider appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal bewilderment. "Both bears are stable and responding well to treatment," Charlie's injuries are healing faster than should be medically possible, and the female, we're calling her Belle, is showing signs of psychological recovery that typically take months to achieve. She pulled up a chair, her next words careful and measured. I've been treating traumatized wildlife for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened between those two bears. Charlie's presence seems to have a genuinely therapeutic effect on Belle's psychological state. She won't eat unless he's nearby, won't sleep unless she can maintain physical contact with him. Marcus understood what Dr. Windrider was suggesting, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it directly. Charlie had somehow learned to provide the genuine emotional support that Blackwood had tried to artificially create through conditioning and drugs. The bear's natural intelligence and capacity for empathy, enhanced by his traumatic experiences, had evolved into something approaching interspecies therapy. What happens now? Marcus asked. Legally, both bears are evidence in an ongoing federal investigation, Chief Stormcrow said, joining their conversation. But realistically, they can't be returned to the wild in their current psychological state. Belle especially needs long-term rehabilitation that could take years. Maggie spoke up quietly. There's another option. The Tribal Council has been discussing the creation of a traditional healing sanctuary, a place where both animals and humans can recover from trauma using indigenous methods combined with modern veterinary care. The idea resonated with something deep in Marcus's chest, a sense of rightness that transcended practical considerations. Charlie could help other animals, couldn't he? Ones that have been through similar trauma? Dr. Windrider nodded slowly. With proper oversight and ethical guidelines, yes, his natural healing abilities could be channeled into legitimate therapeutic work, but it would require unprecedented collaboration between veterinary medicine, psychology, and traditional healing practices. As they talked, Marcus became aware of movement in the hallway outside. Through the ICU's glass walls, he could see Charlie being transported on a modified gurney, his massive frame requiring special equipment designed for large wildlife. The bear was conscious and alert, his dark eyes scanning the hospital environment with calm assessment rather than fear. What struck Marcus most powerfully was Charlie's demeanor. Despite everything he'd endured, the captivity, the experiments, the flood, the injuries, the bear showed no signs of the traumatized withdrawal they'd seen in the other animals. Instead, Charlie projected a sense of purpose and peace that seemed to affect everyone around him. Nurses paused in their rounds to watch him pass, their faces softening with something approaching wonder. He's not just surviving, Marcus realized aloud. He's choosing to heal, and he's choosing to help others heal. Maggie smiled for the first time since the rescue. In the old stories, bears were teachers who helped humans understand the balance between strength and gentleness. Maybe Charlie's just remembering what his people were always meant to do. As if responding to her words, Charlie turned his great head toward the ICU window. For a moment his eyes met Marcus's through the glass, and in that gaze Marcus saw forgiveness so complete that it took his breath away. The bear held his look for several heartbeats, then continued down the hallway toward his own recovery, carrying with him the promise of healing that extended far beyond his own wounded body. In that moment, Marcus understood that the flood hadn't just destroyed Blackwood's facility. It had washed away the barriers between species, between traditional and modern healing, between punishment and redemption. What emerged from the waters was something entirely new, the possibility that love and understanding could transcend even the deepest wounds inflicted by those who claimed to heal. 6 months after the flood, the Clearwater Healing Sanctuary occupied 40 acres of pristine forest land donated by the Cherokee Nation, its natural enclosures and traditional healing lodges blending seamlessly into the Olympic Peninsula landscape. Marcus walked the morning patrol routes he'd helped design, watching Charlie lead a group of rescued animals through what could only be described as therapy sessions beneath the towering Douglas firs. The sanctuary had become something unprecedented in wildlife rehabilitation, a place where traditional indigenous healing practices merged with modern veterinary science to address not just physical injuries, but the deeper psychological wounds that conventional treatment often missed. Charlie, now fully recovered from his flood injuries, had emerged as the sanctuary's most remarkable success story and most gifted healer. Belle followed at Charlie's side, her transformation from the catatonic creature they'd found in Blackwood's facility nothing short of miraculous. Under Charlie's patient guidance, she'd not only recovered her natural bear behaviors, but had developed an intuitive understanding of which animals needed comfort and which needed space to heal on their own terms. Together, they formed the emotional core of a community that included 3 other flood survivors, 5 animals rescued from illegal captivity operations, and a rotating population of creatures recovering from various forms of human-inflicted trauma. "Morning report," Maggie called from the sanctuary's main lodge, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found her true calling late in life. At 69, she'd become the sanctuary's director, combining her traditional Cherokee knowledge with insights gained from watching Charlie's innovative approaches to interspecies healing. "We've got visitors coming today, the congressional committee that's been investigating wildlife trafficking." Marcus nodded, understanding the significance. The sanctuary's success had attracted national attention, particularly after Dr. Windrider published her groundbreaking research on Charlie's therapeutic techniques. The bear's ability to calm traumatized animals, teach appropriate social behaviors, and somehow communicate complex emotional concepts across species lines had challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and the nature of healing itself. But success brought scrutiny, and Marcus knew that today's visit would determine whether the sanctuary could continue its work or would be absorbed into the federal bureaucracy that governed wildlife rehabilitation. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for the animals they'd saved, but for the revolutionary approach to healing that Charlie had taught them all. "How's our star patient this morning?" Marcus asked, referring to the newest arrival, a young mountain lion rescued from an illegal exotic pet operation in California. The cat had been so psychologically damaged by years of confinement that traditional rehabilitation methods had failed completely. "See for yourself," Maggie replied with a smile that spoke of miracles witnessed daily. Marcus walked to the observation platform overlooking Charlie's favorite teaching area, a natural amphitheater formed by fallen trees and moss-covered boulders. The mountain lion sat at the edge of the clearing, still wary, but no longer catatonic. Charlie lay nearby, close enough to provide comfort but far enough away to avoid triggering the cat's trauma responses. Between them, 3 rescued wolf pups played with the casual confidence of animals who'd never known fear. What amazed Marcus most was the subtlety of Charlie's intervention. The bear wasn't actively engaging with the mountain lion. Instead, he was simply being present, modeling calm behavior while allowing the cat to observe normal social interactions among the other animals. It was therapy through example, healing through patient demonstration that trust was possible. Dr. Windrider emerged from the veterinary clinic, her tablet computer filled with data that would have seemed like science fiction 6 months ago. Charlie's cortisol levels remained stable even during high-stress interventions, she reported. His ability to regulate his own stress response while helping others is unprecedented in the literature. "Any theories on how he does it?" Marcus asked. "I think his captivity taught him something we're just beginning to understand," Dr. Windrider replied thoughtfully. "Traditional animal behavior is largely instinctual, fight, flight, or freeze responses that evolved over millions of years. But Charlie's trauma forced him to develop conscious control over those responses. He learned to think his way through fear rather than just react to it." The observation resonated with Marcus's own journey toward healing. His sessions with the tribal counselors had taught him similar lessons about processing grief and guilt through conscious choice rather than emotional reflex. Perhaps trauma, when survived and integrated properly, could indeed become a source of wisdom and strength. A convoy of black SUVs announced the arrival of the congressional delegation, led by Representative Sara Martinez, chair of the House Committee on Natural Resources. Marcus had researched her background, a former veterinarian from New Mexico with a reputation for pragmatic problem-solving and genuine concern for animal welfare issues. "Mr. Thompson," Representative Martinez said as she approached the observation platform, "we've read Dr. Windrider's research, but I have to admit we came here somewhat skeptical. The claims about Charlie's abilities seem extraordinary." "I understand your skepticism," Marcus replied. 6 months ago, I would have felt the same way. But sometimes extraordinary circumstances create extraordinary solutions. He guided the delegation through the sanctuary, explaining the philosophy that governed their work. Traditional indigenous healing recognized the interconnectedness of all living things, the understanding that trauma in one being affected the entire community. Modern veterinary science provided the medical framework to support healing, but Charlie had shown them how to bridge the gap between clinical treatment and emotional recovery. The congressional representatives observed quietly as Charlie worked with the traumatized mountain lion, their skepticism gradually giving way to wonder. The bear's patience was infinite, his understanding of the cat's psychological state almost telepathic. When the mountain lion finally moved closer to the group of playing wolf pups, Representative Martinez audibly gasped. "How long has he been working with that cat?" she asked. 3 weeks, Marcus replied. Traditional rehabilitation programs estimate 18 months minimum for this level of recovery, if it's achievable at all. Dr. Blackwood chose that moment to make his appearance, walking slowly but steadily along the sanctuary's main path. His recovery from the flood injuries had been long and painful, but his transformation went far deeper than physical healing. The man who emerged from his coma bore little resemblance to the obsessed veterinarian who'd operated the illegal research facility. "Representative Martinez," he said, extending his hand with genuine humility. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address your committee." The Congresswoman studied him carefully. "Dr. Blackwood, your previous work was the subject of significant controversy. Why should we trust your assessment of this sanctuary's methods?" Blackwood's answer came without hesitation. "Because I spent years trying to artificially create what Charlie does naturally. I used drugs, conditioning, and psychological manipulation to force animals into therapeutic roles they weren't ready to fill. I caused immeasurable suffering in pursuit of healing that I thought could be engineered rather than nurtured." He gestured toward the clearing where Charlie continued his patient work. "What you see here is the difference between genuine healing and manufactured therapy. Charlie chooses to help because he's been allowed to heal first. The animals trust him because his compassion is real, not conditioned." Representative Martinez followed Blackwood's gaze, watching as the mountain lion finally approached close enough for Charlie to offer a gentle touch. The moment of contact was brief but profound, the wildcat accepting comfort from a creature that should have been either predator or prey, but had somehow become something else entirely. "What are you asking from Congress?" she inquired. Marcus had prepared for this question, but his answer came from the heart rather than any script. "Recognition that healing doesn't always follow the models we expect. Funding to expand this approach to other regions where wildlife trafficking and abuse are problems. And most importantly, protection from bureaucratic requirements that would force us to choose between traditional methods and modern innovation." The delegation spent the rest of the day observing the sanctuary's operations, interviewing staff, and documenting the remarkable recoveries they witnessed. As afternoon faded into evening, Representative Martinez pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. "Off the record," she said, "what you've accomplished here challenges everything I thought I knew about animal psychology and trauma recovery. But some of my colleagues are going to question whether this represents legitimate science or just wishful thinking. Marcus considered his response carefully. 6 months ago, I was a broken man who'd lost his son and blamed himself for failures that weren't entirely his fault. Traditional therapy helped, but it was Charlie who taught me that healing isn't just about processing trauma. It's about choosing to transform that trauma into wisdom that can help others. He looked out across the sanctuary, where evening light filtered through the forest canopy to illuminate a community that shouldn't have been possible. Maybe what we're doing here isn't traditional science. Maybe it's something older and more fundamental, the recognition that all healing is ultimately about love, patience, and the courage to trust again. Representative Martinez nodded slowly. I'll be recommending full federal support for the sanctuary's expansion. What Charlie has achieved here isn't just remarkable. It's exactly what our approach to wildlife rehabilitation should have been all along. As the congressional delegation departed, Marcus found himself standing beside Charlie in the sanctuary's heart, watching Belle teach a group of rescued cubs the fine art of fishing in the restored creek. The flood that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been a beginning, the washing away of old wounds to make room for new growth. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most profound healing comes not from avoiding trauma, but from learning to transform it into something beautiful and life-giving. Charlie had taught them all that survival was just the first step. The real miracle was choosing to thrive and to help others do the same. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by creatures who had found their way back to trust and joy, Marcus finally understood what his son Tommy would have wanted him to learn, that love doesn't end with loss, but transforms into something larger and more enduring than any individual life. The sanctuary would continue, the healing would spread, and somewhere in the ancient wisdom of the forest, new stories of redemption were just beginning to unfold. Sometimes life breaks us so completely that we forget healing is even possible. Marcus Thompson thought his world ended when he lost his son Tommy, carrying guilt and grief that seemed too heavy to bear. But deep in the Olympic forests, a remarkable bear named Charlie was about to teach him that our greatest wounds can become our most powerful gifts. Charlie had survived unspeakable trauma in illegal research facilities, yet instead of becoming bitter or broken, he chose something extraordinary. He became a healer. When Marcus found Charlie trapped and dying, neither man nor bear knew they were about to discover that love transcends species, that forgiveness can transform the deepest pain into profound purpose, and that sometimes our most unexpected teachers come on 4 paws instead of 2 feet. Their journey from despair to hope, from isolation to community, reminds us that we're never too old to find new meaning, never too hurt to help others heal, and never too lost to come home to ourselves. The Clearwater Healing Sanctuary they built together stands as proof that when we stop running from our pain and start transforming it into compassion, miracles happen. What broken part of your heart is ready to become your superpower? Have you ever experienced unexpected healing through connection with an animal? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.